Chapter 3. Handprints of Horror. Laura pressed her hand to burning temples. No one believed her, not even the sheriff. Yet faint hope he had promised help. He was efficient, he knew the woods. Perhaps. A dull ache pervaded her being. Somehow, she knew that Beasley would never find Frank. That skull-faced man with the whip, driving his chained maniacs along, no human being could find him. A little moan parted her gelid lips. Old Matt Kroll stirred. His shrunken visage was a faint blur behind the counter. "What ye aim to do now, Miss Standish?" His voice was high and querulous. Laura started. She had forgotten he was still there. Suddenly she was afraid of this store of flickering, yellow shadows, of the weazened storekeeper whose rheumy eyes blinked like those of a cat. I am going back home," she gasped. "Perhaps my husband has returned." Perhaps it was all. She was near the door, poised for flight. She stopped, lifted a bewildered hand to her forehead. Was it possible that it was all a dreadful dream, that she had never seen? Matt pressed the counter with stiff fingers. Driving terror cracked his voice. "Don't ye do that, Miss Standish. Fair God sake, don't ye go back to that place. Stay here in the village. I'll put ye up in my place, only don't go back. If it's—" He broke off, clamped his trembling lips tight. He had said too much. But Laura shook her head wearily. "I must," she said very low. "If Frank is there, he'll need me." Thanks." She fled out into the cool air, driving her aching limbs through the murky dark again. Matt's quavering accents followed her, hoarse with warning, with fear. "Don't go. Wait, I want to." But the dense, marching trees swallowed his words. Up and up she climbed, up to the base of Superstition Mountain where their cottage nestled, the secluded, lonely house in which they had planned to spend such a lovely summer. Laura's lips drew back in a bitter groan even as she flogged her way through the impenetrable darkness. Each tree was a thing of menace, behind which lurked a maniac with glaring eyes. Each whisper of wind in the branches, the crackling hiss of the whip, each rock that loosened beneath her pounding feet clashed with the sound of chains. But one driving purpose held her from going mad, from falling headlong, a gibbering, screaming thing, in the crowding forest. Frank was home waiting for her, wondering where she was, worrying. All the men in the store had said so. Dr. Carey was sure of it. They ought to know, they knew this place and all its tales. She must have imagined it, of course. Something that she had heard in the village and forgotten, had troubled her dreams in front of the waning fire. She had slept, hadn't she? She pumped air into her gasping lungs. It was all very natural. She hadn't awakened until much later, with the dream thick upon her, and she had rushed out like a madman. How Frank would laugh and scold her in that gentle way of his. How the village folk would gossip and whisper about her nerves behind her back. She could never face them again. But dread cramped her limbs again, they had known. She had seen it in their faces, in the way they had slunk from her presence as if she were a plague. She lashed on in the Stygian gloom, heedless of ripping branches and stumbling feet. What terrible conspiracy of silence had been wrapped around her? What awful thing was being hidden from her? They knew what had happened to her husband. They knew, and the blood had drained from their faces, had locked their lips in frozen fear. The faint starshine disclosed the clearing ahead, the place where the chained madman and Frank had clanked on their way to hell. Nothing was there now, nothing but slinking shadows and a blob of trees. She turned up the path, with feet that suddenly dragged. Her heart was a pounding trip hammer. Anticipation squeezed her skull. Soon she would know. The house loomed like an unquiet shadow. A faint flicker of red peeped out at her, died into the merest glimmer. Her heart stopped pumping, she swayed, forced herself erect again. It was true then. She had not dreamt. The door lay on the porch just as it had fallen, and that little whisper of flame was the dying hearth fire in the living room. She moved forward like an automaton. Nothing mattered now. Frank was in chains, a maniac, held in thrall for some frightful purpose. There was nothing for her to live for, nothing. Without knowing what she did, she entered the living room. A dim glow of red stained the bottom of the fireplace. Soon it would be gone, and the advancing shadows would claim the place for their own. She shivered and life flooded her veins again. Oh God, what would she do, alone here, surrounded by creeping shapes, encompassed in darkness? She must have a fire, a great, roaring, blazing fire, to chase the grinning maniacs back to their lairs, to keep her from going mad through the long, dreadful hours before daylight. There was a stack of wood in the alcove recess the other side of the hearth. Frank had chopped it, and sawn it into neat lengths only that morning. How faint and far away it all seemed. Good Lord! What was that? She stopped dead in her tracks, whirled around to face the door. She wanted to scream and could not, icy fingers slithered along her spine. Something was coming up the path, dragging, shuffling, as if dread encased her in a gelid sheath, held her in a death-like grip. Up the stairs to the porch the thing dragged leaden feet, its breath, loud in the stillness, was like a whine. For a moment it hesitated, and the panting grew heavier. Then, slowly, very slowly, it dragged across the creeping boards. Laura felt as if she were in a press that ground her bones to powder and crushed her frozen flesh into a million splinters. Shrieks tore her throat yet could not issue. Something dim and shadowy bulked in the doorway. It swayed, straightened, turned its blurry head from side to side. Then, pad, pad, it was coming in. The bonds of terror broke. Her body flooded with roaring flame. Shriek after shriek burst from her throat. The figure jerked to a halt, then raced forward. Laura! Laura shrank away. Had terror turned her brain, made her insane? But there was nothing unreal about the arms that gripped her tight, the tremulous flow of endearing expressions, tenderness known only to the two of them. It was Frank who held her close, so close that the thumping of her heart was one with the equally loud pounding of his own. It was Frank whose mouth sought hungrily for hers. The ecstasy, the reaction, was too much for her. With a little moan she sank limp in his arms. It must have been only a minute after that she awoke dizzily. Fresh wood on the hearth had just caught, and the yellow, blue flames were licking greedily up the sizzling pitch that exuded from the pine. Frank was bending over her, his face in the shadows. Frank darling, what a dreadful nightmare I had. Can you imagine? I thought you were chained to madmen, that you two were. But it's all over now. You're back, you're really back. She extended aching arms. Kiss me, dearest. Why did he stiffen against her questing arms? Why did he keep his face averted in the shadows? A terrible fear flared through her bursting veins. She lashed upward to her feet from the couch on which she had been extended. She caught the hand that hung limply at his side. The contact sent a chill to her heart, it was so icy cold. Terror seized her again. She dragged him by main force to the fire, kicked with backward heel at the logs on the grate. They flared into a blaze of sparks. The shadows ebbed away from her husband. He tried to disengage himself, to jump back into the fleeing darkness, but she gripped him with desperate strength. Frank! The anguish of her voice beat about him like surf on a rocky shore. His face. Oh God, his face. It was blank and gray in the stormy red of the fire. It was cold and hard and bruised, but the bruises had been washed with painstaking care. In that first moment, his eyes, those eyes that had always glowed with tender love at the sight of his wife, had held a secret glare, a wild, fearful light she had never seen before. But even as she shrieked, something else struggled in their depths, something excited, that tried to mask itself into a poor replica of that former tenderness. A wan smile flitted over his gray countenance that chilled her blood even more than the earlier blankness. Frank was trying to conceal himself from her, to mask from her wifely eyes the hell that raged beneath. "Laura," he muttered, "don't be afraid. Everything will be all right." How terribly strange and stiff his voice sounded, with what effort he spoke. She shrank away from him. "Then it was true, all of it," she gasped. "I don't know what you mean," he said thickly. "Nothing's true. You've been dreaming." Oh God, he too thought that. Or was he pretending, as he would if he were really mad? For the first time in her life, she felt fear in the presence of her husband. What had those monsters done to him? She stared frenziedly at his clothes. They were no longer in disarray, as they had been out there. They had been brushed, smoothed out, but a sleeve was rent, a tear showed on trouser leg. His coat was close about him, as if to hide some dreadful thing beneath. "Tell me the truth." She came close, caught his shoulders, glared into his eyes. He tried to pull away, but she held him fiercely. "Tell me everything. I am your wife. I won't desert you, Frank. I'll care for you, I'll nurse you." Her voice broke, back to health. "Only tell me." "There's nothing to tell," he said vaguely, and his gaze slithered past her. "But I must be getting back, there are things I must do." "But you," and for the first time the warmth of human emotion crept into his voice, "you must not stay here, Laura. You must go to the village at once, to Dr. Carey. Stay there until you hear from me again. And for God's sake, in the name of our love, of all that we meant to each other, do not ask me any more questions now, and do not stir from Dr. Carey's house until you hear from me. Do you understand? No matter what else you hear or see." His voice was urgent, imploring now. He gripped her slender arms with fingers that were chilled with cold. His eyes swung to hers, in their depths was driving desperation, but, thank God, no trace of madness. Laura swayed happily. Her husband was sane, sane as she was. The whole thing had been a confused nightmare. She had mistaken someone else who resembled him in that furtive, shimmering moonlight. He wanted to protect her. He knew there were unclean things on the mountain. She would not ask questions. "All right, Frank," she murmured, "I'll do as you say." Again she saw that strange gleam in his eyes. He dropped his hold, tugged at his coat pocket. His arm came out, holding a small flashlight. "Here," he said with queer, strained voice once more. "I got it in the village for you. You'll need it to show you the road." She reached for it dully. His long, lean hand was out, extended, holding the black cylinder with scrubbed fingers. The sleeve of his coat fell back a bit. No shirt cuff showed. His wrist protruded, bare and white. Bare and... The flashlight dropped with a clatter to the floor. She had seen. Oh God, she had seen. Everything was true, everything. The house rocked before her fainting vision, her husband's face swung in a hideous, distorted arc. A whimper of fear wheezed in her throat. Frank caught her haunted gaze, followed it stupidly to its focus on his exposed wrist. A broad red mark encircled his flesh, a sinister band against the dead, white pallor of his arm. A metal manacle had dug deep into that skin and shrinking flesh, a manacle which had been recently removed. His eyes came up smoldering, then flared with strange lights. His lips worked madly. He mouthed thick, indistinguishable words. Laura shrank back from the man who was her husband. Terror fought with the great love she had borne him. In a delirious flash, she saw everything. Frank had come back to her, a madman. He was no longer the man she had loved. He had come back, transformed, bestial, crafty with the perverted cunning of the insane, to entice her into the woods, where his fellow creatures could pounce upon her. She flung up a warding hand. Her horror-warped mind burst into a flare of rocketing lights. Toneless shrieks tore her frame to shreds. Her husband too, a step forward, hands clawing out. She stumbled back until her heel thudded against solid wall. Then, suddenly, he stopped, listened with tense fixity. Outside, from far away, came a faint, terrible sound. The unmistakable hiss of a whip slashing through the night. Frank seemed to hesitate. His clouded gaze swung irresolutely from his whimpering wife to the door. The whip cracked again, nearer, louder. One quick, startled glance, he was racing toward the door, racing as if, oh God, his master was calling him. The bonds of fear fell from Laura. One desperate thought hammered at her brain. He was going back to that troop of the damned, back to the hell from which he had come. He was leaving her forever. She started away from the wall. She stumbled across the expanse of floor. Tears blinded her eyes, weariness locked her limbs to nightmare slowness. Frank, come back to me. Frank, don't go, don't leave me, she wailed. But he did not hear, he could not hear. Out there in the woods, black with the blackness of hell, came swift, rustling sounds. Then a sudden crash, followed by a silence thick with unknown terror. Laura stumbled out on the porch, tripped, fell headlong to hard, unyielding boards. Somewhere, far off, before she drifted into oblivion, a thing raised its voice in an eerie, gloating chuckle. An ape, like maniac, pressed close over her rigid body. Laura could feel the glare in his red-rimmed eyes, the fader of his breath. His hand slithered clammily under her shoulder, something hard and unutterably cold pressed against her ribs. A chain rattled loud in her ear. With a faint shriek, she opened her eyes. Dim in the starlight, a figure bulked heavily over her. Even as fear parted her lips, it moved away, the small, hard object lifted. The chain gleamed yellow against a rounded background. Dr. Alva Carey clucked soothingly as he crammed his stethoscope back into his vest pocket, jingled his watch chain. You gave me quite a turn, Laura, finding you stretched out unconscious like that. But you're all right. Slowly Laura's fuddled senses focused on reality again. For a moment she stared upward at the rubicund, kindly seeming face of the rotund doctor. There was something in his eyes that he tried to hide, something that belied the cheerfulness of his smile. She tottered to her feet. Fear beat with thudding wings against her ribs. What was masked behind that smile? What had he been about to do before she wakened? Dr. Carey moved toward her. How carefully casual was his voice. Frank come back yet? He asked. Frank. Laura glared wildly around. Great God, had she forgotten? The broken door leered vacantly back at her. The woods were a darkling, sinister stretch. Superstition Mountain reared its vast, inaccessible bulk directly to the rear, a gigantic, truncated mass of stone against a frost-blue sky. She wrung her bleeding hands. He's gone again, she wailed. He was here, mad, like the rest. Then, the whip cracked, calling for him, and he went. I must have fainted. All former fears were forgotten in the agony of that terrible recital. Frank, her husband, was gone forever, a maniac. She caught hold of the doctor's sleeve with imploring, desperate gesture. Dr. Carey, she cried, you must find him, you must save him. The doctor pulled away. His eyes were hard, blue pebbles, and they refused to meet her anguished ones. They stole surreptitiously to the flattened top of the mountain, flicked away again. I'll see what I can do, he muttered evasively. In the meantime, he continued, and for the first time he stared directly at the girl. "I want you." She shrank away as he moved closer. She was suddenly afraid of this doctor who had mocked at her story in the village, who had appeared without explanation at this place in the heart of the woods, and who looked at her so strangely. He reached out to lay his hand on her arm. Laura jerked blindly away, whirled to run, when both froze in their tracks as if turned to stone. Far off, so far it seemed to emanate from the distant sky, came a long, drawn-out howl. It was the howl of a man in the last agony of pain. It was the bitter cry of a human being whom torture had bereft of reason. It was the voice of Frank Standish. Close on its heels came a fainter sound, muffled but unmistakable and sinister in its implications. The sharp hiss of a whip lashing across a bared, slashed back. Hiss, crack, swish. But no further answering noise from a tortured throat. Then all was silence again, as if the shuddering sky had closed its portals against such dreadful deeds. Laura's flesh crawled on her skeleton, red lightning thundered in her skull. With an inarticulate moan she tottered forward, stumbled, and fell. Dr. Carey stood momentarily motionless on the porch. The starshine shimmered with ghastly pallor on his rounded form. His ruddy smoothness had become grim and hard and gray. His eyes were fuliginous flares. His lips writhed in gray distortion. "So they've started," he snarled. The next instant, he was pounding down the steps, over the clearing, up the rutted lumber road toward the mountain. Over his shoulder he yelled in a queer, harsh voice, "Stay where you are, Laura. Don't you dare leave the place." Then all sound ceased, and the woods became alive with stealth and the noiseless groping of eerie things. Laura rose unsteadily to her feet. Her limbs were water-weak, her skin a prickling sheath of horror. But one consuming thought blazed in her brain. It seared all fears, all dread for her own safety to shriveled, tenuous wisps. Frank had cried out like a mindless animal. Frank was in the clutch of a devil who drove the creatures he had made mad with whip and clanking chains. She, and she alone, must save her husband. But where was he? From what distant lair in that ominous, far-spreading forest had that tortured wail emanated? She clenched her lips until the blood came. Despair overwhelmed her. The woods billowed like a waveless ocean, vast, interminable. No further sound drifted to her straining ears. That strange, roaring noise she heard was the pounding of her own blood. Suddenly she stiffened. Superstition Mountain. The great, truncated block of primeval stone slashed the star-studded brambles, scrambling through rubble and sky like a grotesque titan. Its treeless, granite flank scowled down upon her with lowering laughter. Dr. Carey had flicked his surreptitious glance at its ominous bulk, had looked hastily away when he thought she saw. At Frank's last anguished shriek, he had raced up the old lumber road, the twin, dirt tracks that dwindled to a trail and died abruptly at the grim up-thrust of the barrier wall. Dim, half-heard stories swarmed her fevered brain, crawled into every nook and cranny of her mind. Stories she had heard on the few occasions she had gone with Frank to the village to get their mail, to buy supplies. Stories that had been mumbled around the inevitable pot-bellied stove in the general store, of strange lights that gleamed on certain moonless nights on the sawed-off top of Superstition Mountain, where no human being had ever climbed. In the dim, long past, hardier men than those who now inhabited the fated village of Squam had tried to scale those sheer, granite walls. None had ever returned, no trace of their bodies had ever been found. It was they, claimed the villagers with bated breath, who, neither dead nor alive, were doomed to a dreadful eternity on the inaccessible top of the mountain. Their thin shrieks were heard on still nights as they bent under the lash of the devil who drove them on his hellish business. They and others who had gone into the woods since then and never returned. Death came from causes unknown, from drowning in bottomless pond, from the wildcats that still lurked in the farther forest, from accidental discharge of their own guns. But the natives of Squam knew better. and cowered at night under blankets when the lightnings played over that grim, stony mass and the crackling thunders were dreadfully like the crack of a snaking whip. Frank had laughed at those stories raucously, and she herself, intent on her purchases from old Matt Kroll, had smiled at with half-absent thoughts. Only Lem, the cobbler atheist, and Dr. Carey, of the village folk, had not believed, and Lem alone had aired his opinions with harsh contempt.